In this final segment on labor unions, I'd like to take a look at other forms of labor union models. The Hicks bargaining model that we saw in the prior segment really doesn't tell us about the union or supply and demand issues with the union. It does give us a good indicator or predictor of strikes and the length of strikes, and helps us understand something of wage gains that might take place. What I'd like to look at now, though, are a couple of different model forms. One that thinks about labor union supply and demand, in this case, the union itself being the good in this market, and the union due being the price for receiving that good. And then we'll take a look at union and non-union sectors of labor supply and demand, and think about how union and non-union sectors within the same general regional or mobilized market will affect supply, demand, wages, etc. First, let's think about the labor union supply and demand, where the union membership itself is the good. Well, it wouldn't surprise you that we have an upward sloping supply curve for union membership and a downward sloping demand curve for union membership, and that these will then be representing the utility expectations that workers, who are the ones that are demanding membership or not, that workers are expecting to receive as the membership goes up and as the price changes as well. And as you might imagine, we achieve some M star or membership star, so optimal level of union membership based upon some D star or dues star, optimal level of dues. When the dues being requested by the labor union go up, then you can suppose that we see changes in this. If the dues themselves simply go up from, let's say, D star to D prime, then we would expect us to go D star, or rather D prime and M prime, which would then cause the supply relation perhaps to shift in and to the left, which would then be consistent with our seeing that we end up with a lower level of membership. Or if dues went down in price, then we would see just the opposite. Now, we might have to think about this. Well, what about if the benefits that can be obtained or the wages that can be obtained change? Well, similarly, if we find that wages or the expectation of wage increases are high, then we find just the opposite type of relationship rather than these changes I've indicated. We find that that's going to give us a shift outward in labor demand, in which case we go from labor demand to labor demand, or excuse me, from dues demanded as opposed to labor demand, excuse me. So we see a shift outward in membership demanded and the dues that are going to be paid, such that we see perhaps a justification for higher levels of dues, motivating a higher level of union membership. So let's think about union sectors and non-union sectors in an economy. We know that, let's assume we start with an economy with a joint sectors where we have a labor supply and a labor demand curve that are the same, because it's simply one sector as we begin, so they have the same supply and demand curves. But that a union comes into the sector and it succeeds in organizing some of the workers in a sector for certain jobs or to work with certain firms. And when that takes place, there typically is some wage concession that's made, which increases wages. We go from our equilibrium wage of W0 to W1, which is going to then reduce the number of workers that are hired by those firms. The firms that are facing those higher wages are going to have removed some of their workers, laid off some of the workers, maybe substituted them for some non-human form of labor or some technological improvements in the production process, such that they are going to have fewer workers now. They're producing their goods at this higher wage. And so we see the labor supply curve to move to the left. Well, we would expect then to see in the non-union sector of the same market, which now really is a non-union sector, it's now a bifurcated market, some of them members of the union, some of them not members of the union, and we would expect that that would cause wage declines to take place as we had some of the displaced workers that had had belonged to those or worked for those companies that are now unionized are seeking jobs, they would go to the non-union sector, and that would naturally drive wages down, but also increase the number of workers. However, this is not always the case. This is what we would expect to see, and clearly from a classical economic standpoint, equilibrating supplies, demands, shifting workers from one segment to another, which also would then be shifting production from one segment to another, we find that this doesn't always take place. Part of the reason it doesn't always take place is this concept we talked about in a prior module, and that's sticky wages. But also then, we find that it takes time for some of these firms to be able to absorb new workers, to increase their production capacity, and perhaps these they don't have the opportunity to do this. Maybe there is no labor supply that they'll absorb, and so we find that in fact in some cases the non-union sector will maintain its original wage. And we find in yet other cases that the non-union sector actually sees an increase in wage. Well, that's just the opposite of what we might predict in our classical economic structure. So why is that? Well, we find that there are spillover effects. The influence in the union sector, which is going to be increasing theoretically the quality of the worker, the training available to the worker, the wages of the worker, the productivity of the worker. These are all the promises that the union is making to the firm in the collective bargaining process. Well, if that's the case, then those effects will spill over into the non-union sector, such that perhaps the non-union sector will have to increase their wages as well. So the influence of the union is significant, whether the union is actually involved in a particular company or not. So as I've mentioned some of my biases with respect to unions, my final comment here about unions is I love labor unions, and I can't stand labor unions. I'm not schizophrenic, and I'm not bipolar, so let me help you understand what I mean by this. I can't stand labor unions because as a child I so clearly remember the difficulties that they represented for my household. I have a difficulty with labor unions because I know that whenever you have such significant numbers of relatively low-skilled, low-educated employees together and significant dollar amounts pooling in various dues, revenues and various pension funds and such, that you are nearly inviting organized crime and you're nearly inviting corruption. So I dislike those elements. I dislike that labor unions will lobby the halls of Congress for different measures, different regulations, different laws that are sympathetic to the union, even though they may not always be sympathetic to the interests of their average worker. Those are some of the things that I haven't liked over the years about labor unions. So what do I mean when I say I love them? Well, think about the gains that have been made in our country because of the effect of labor unions. If you've ever received vacation pay, you have a labor union to thank for that. If you've ever received sick pay, you have a labor union to thank for that. If you've ever received time and a half or premium time or overtime, you have a labor union to thank for that. The laws governing safety standards, the OSHA standards in our country, are a direct result of union bargaining and union lobbying efforts. So on one hand, as a labor economist, I very much appreciate the influence of labor unions. On the other hand, I see some of the drawbacks as well. So I think that what I really would have to say is I'm grateful for the existence of labor unions and the fact that they've brought about so many gains for the American worker, of which you and I probably are both part. But I also recognize that they've passed their time and that the decline in labor unions is warranted. We no longer have as significant a need because so many of the gains have been made, but I'm grateful the labor unions continue to exist. If they did not, then we perhaps would end up back in a state where the collective influence of profit-seeking firms, maybe that are sometimes a little too short-sighted, would then gain in such a way as some of those gains that we have had as workers would decline, and we might end up back in a situation where we desperately need a labor union again, which I'd rather not see.